The deadly conflict in Sudan has displaced over 6 million people and killed tens of thousands of others. And in Darfur, yet another genocide. Across this African country, a humanitarian crisis of an unprecedented scale continues to unfold. Yet, the global focus is on the war in Gaza and Ukraine. But it isn't just Sudan that has moved away from the limelight. The turmoil in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, South Sudan, the Central African Republic, Libya and Somalia have stopped grabbing headline news. So this week on the program, we ask, are Africa's wars being forgotten? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Before we bring in our panel of experts, let's take a closer look at the impact of some of the major conflicts in Africa. In Sudan, conflict between the Sudanese armed forces and the Rapid Support Forces erupted in April this year, forcing around 6.6 million people to flee their homes, with children making up half of these displaced individuals. More than 12,000 people have been killed, and it's also devastating the economy. The World Bank estimates that Sudan's economy is to contract by 12% in 2023. And moving to the Democratic Republic of Congo, where renewed conflict with rebels has displaced a record-breaking 7 million people in the east. The nation has been facing political instability and armed violence since 1996, with an estimated 6 million people killed since the conflict began. Meanwhile, the Central African Republic has been grappling with conflict since 2012, as fighting between the mostly Christian anti-Balaka militia and the mainly Muslim Seleka rebel coalition killed thousands and left 2 out of 3 civilians dependent on humanitarian aid. Now, despite peacemaking efforts, attacks by armed groups continue to hurt the economy and lead to serious human rights violations. Well, let's now bring in our panel of experts. With me in studio, Dr. Hassan Kanenje, Director of the Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies. In Abuja, David Otto Endele, Director for the Geneva Center for Africa Security and Strategic Studies. And in Kampala, joining us via Zoom, Ambassador Simon Mulongo, former Deputy Head of AMISOM. Gentlemen, a very warm welcome to you all. Thank you for joining in today. Let me start off with you, David, because I want to get your insight for all of you. A lot of global attention has seemingly been given to conflicts outside of the continent in the recent past. Have Africa's conflicts been forgotten or sidelined? As a result, is there a shifting limelight? Let me start off with you, David.
Well, I think you're very correct. But I think, we've always got to understand that when it comes to conflict, everyone looks after what is in their greatest national interest. And it is correct to say that the global community, so-called, has ignored a lot of the conflicts that have taken part or continue to take part in the African continent, from the northern part of Africa, talking about areas like Libya, to the central part of Africa, Central African Republic, Cameroon, DRC, Congo, to conflicts in western part of Africa, Nigeria, the ongoing coup d'etats in the Sahel belt, up to the northern and eastern part of Africa again. If you're talking about countries like Mozambique, experiencing terrorism from Al-Shabaab or the Machababus, as they call them locally. And of course, Somalia with Al-Shabaab. So the many conflicts, that are taking part in Africa, not to forget the existing one in Sudan, which is being fought by the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese Armed Forces. Right. That is also an ongoing conflict. Ethiopia shouldn't be forgotten. Yes, I think, issues within Russia and Ukraine, have become the major focus of the Western countries, and recently the conflict ongoing between Hamas and Israel. But the bottom line, Beatrice, is that nobody has more interest in a conflict than those who are involved in it. So what we have seen recently is that those that have big dogs in the fight, the West, would always pay more attention and ignore the conflicts that do not, have so much national interest, and in their benefit. So it's all about geopolitics, Beatrice, and that is also playing out when it comes to conflict focus in Africa and in the global world.
Ambassador Mulongo, let me get your view here as a former deputy head of AMISOM, particularly when it comes to the case of Somalia. Has that fallen off the limelight?
Somalia is getting out of the radar of the Western or international community because of mainly economic fatigue. They think that the mission has taken too long and that they need to reconsider how they should be funding. And in any case, we think that the security responsibilities should be transitioned to the Somali security forces. So the current program is to make sure that the size down the foreign forces in favor of Somali security forces. I think that is definitely going to pose a big challenge because the security forces of Somalia are not yet ready, and that's the great fear to us. We don't want to have another conundrum of Afghanistan in Somalia. So the whole thing is that they seem to be paying attention more to Eastern Europe and now to the Middle East. And initially it was West Africa, but now the dynamics in West Africa are such that they are having negative attitude about European and other international forces there. So I think it is because we seem not to be aligning with their strategic interests as far as Somalia is concerned. Right. So it becomes still a problem to Africans.
Dr. Kanenje, your take?
I wouldn't say the conflicts in African conflicts particularly have been forgotten. I would say they've been pushed on the margins, in part because, as the ambassador has indicated, they do not fall within the strategic national interest, especially of those advanced economies. And with the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, of course, Africa is increasingly becoming an afterthought, which again, based on the history of what we have seen and what happened in Afghanistan, is a giant mistake if actually we're going to forget this conflict, because ultimately the things are going to come home to bite us if we don't solve them today.
But what happens though when a conflict drops off the map or is put on the periphery?
It doesn't go away, it becomes intractable. But then it evolves in ways that can become a monster that cannot exactly, becomes almost immune to resolution. And if we cannot move towards arresting such situations, then we have to prepare ourselves to actually a bigger and more complicated situation. Today, as we speak, there is a conflict, in Sudan, and we applaud African countries and the African Union and regional countries to moving the direction of actually trying to bring some peace there. But you're not seeing a lot of, for instance, Western interest in trying to support that effort to the extent which, for instance, they engaged in Palestine, or rather they engaged in Ukraine, or even some of what they're doing, for instance, in Palestine. And of course, as indicated, Somalia is a very fragile country. It is not in a position today to be able to take over security of itself. But AMISOM and ATMIS forces are closing down. And yet there is really no discussion of continued support for that, which means countries in the region will have to assume that responsibility because they have the most interest in it. And I think to the extent that it's not being discussed, in the manner in which it should be discussed by the international community, of course, I think explains or is a testament to where it has been placed when it comes to priority.
David, I want to come back to that question of Sudan, because Sudan remains very much in conflict, and that conflict started out, early this year in April. Why has so much attention been taken away from Sudan, for instance?
The main issues has been that both sides, have refused. I think bearing in mind the fact that they have massive support, from different interested parties outside the country. That keeps them going, in terms of battlefield, capabilities. So that has been an issue because, of course, there is this idea that one of them can win. But of course, we know that with this kind of conflict, it will drag on if there is no leverage. Because I think what has been the main issue within Sudan has been that the rapid support forces want to make sure that they control the power infrastructure. The Sudanese armed forces are denying them, the outright control of those infrastructures. So no one has, the right leverage to come to the table, knowing that they will be considered. So there is no unified approach. One of the biggest weaknesses has been that the Sudanese themselves, have seemed to mortgage the solution to the likes of the United States, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, which of course, when other conflicts kick in, as we've seen in the case of Israel and Hamas, then these so-called superpowers begin to weigh in between who to support more and who to support less. Sudan has been the victim of less support. It has been the victim of less focus as we speak.
Right.
So, of course, the conflict is going to drag on and become intractable as we've seen it. And I think Africa needs to learn one key lesson.
Right.
We've got to solve our problems ourselves. The African Union needs to, put on its seatbelt and, try and make sure that the shocks that comes from this conflict are being cushioned by its strategic, interventions within the continent.
So, Ambassador Mulongo, we've heard about the economic fatigue that has set in, particularly with Sudan and Somalia's situation. How do you keep a conflict, though, on the globe, in touch with global attention?
In the first place, the international community seem to be distracted, and they don't seem to have a clear interest in the Sudan, even if we know that Sudan is extremely strategic. Because the Sudan straddles from the Red Sea, which is the main trade way, and all through into the Sahel. This makes it extremely strategic and cannot you cannot afford to have it ignored. I think it is the regional leaders who should make sure that as they're trying to attempt in Djibouti, to make sure that they bring into play those other actors, particularly the Troika and other powers that have been engaged, and they make sure that they create a mechanism that can bring them to the floor of the discussion table. And that's very, very important. So we need to have the region take a greater interest and also use that as a platform to invite other international players to come into play.
So, Dr. Kaneje, you've talked about the conflicts not being entirely forgotten, but in your view, though, are there instances where conflicts in Africa were initially forgotten but later on gained global attention?
Yeah, most certainly. One of that has to do with the very fragile, agreements that existed, especially in Angola, before the outbreak again of another Angolan war. The discussions that revolving around the peace accord in Arusha were largely, pushed by African countries. Mostly foreign, East countries, for instance, were missing, including international institutions. And then that was followed by the genocide, and so we had to come back a little bit too late. The conflict, of course, in Ethiopia that had been simmering for a while. It was not until things got really worse that now the world, woke up to realize, things had gotten out of hand. And so there are many instances where conflicts that had been left to simmer and then get out of hand, of course, and that is something that it should be preempted. You need more preemptive mechanisms or approaches as opposed to reactive, because a lot of times it's too late when you are acting after the fact.
Well, David, even if it is about a lack of interest or economic fatigue from the global community, though, and you've talked about Africa needing to take matters into its own hands, but there is really a question of finances when it comes to Africa's part, isn't there?
Finance is it's a big issue when it comes to carrying out interventions in conflict-ridden areas. But each country has, an individual capacity to to deploy the required resources. Conflicts are just a subset of, a country's problem. They do not encompass the entire country. So I really think, it's more an issue of, committing the various resources that are required. But largely, Beatrice, I don't think, in my experience, most of the conflicts have not been resolved as a result of lack of resources from a financial point. I think it's been more regarding greed on one hand, but on the other hand, you have interested players who are within and outside the country who benefit from the chaos. So the main issue, especially if you look at the case of Sudan, Sudan is a fairly rich country, despite been engulfed by an urban warfare. And I truly do not believe that the reason why the war goes on is because Sudan does not have the resources to resolve it, but simply because both sides have stuck to their heels, and there is no room for reconciliation. Even if you look at the conflict in Somalia, yes, of course, the government may be deficient in terms of its economic capabilities, but there has been enough resources pumped into the Somalian system, to use that word, that could be used. But if that money is not being well managed, or is being diverted to other issues, and this is where corruption jumps in very quickly, then of course these issues become perennial, to speak. So it is not about the resources. It's not about the money that Africans do not have to resolve their issues. It is about the political will and commitment. It is about greed, corruption. But the elephant in the room, is that this conflict benefit a lot of the external parties and some of those who are internal as well. So we've got to bring all those elements, all those indices together in order for us to get the continent where it is supposed to be, or where it deserves to be, in my opinion.
All right, on that note, let's take a short break, and when we come back, we will look at why Africa's conflicts are difficult to resolve and how Africa can re-engineer its conflict resolution mechanisms. To stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now let's continue with our discussion. Still with me, Dr. Hassan Kanenje, David Otto Endele, and Ambassador Simon Molongo. Ambassador Molongo, I want to come back particularly with this long-running conflict in Somalia. What factors, in your view, though, would you say differentiate the global response to conflicts in Africa from other parts of the world? Because the global community has been trying to stabilize Somalia for at least 30 years.
I think the whole thing is the unresolved ideological differences between Western forms of democracy and the Middle Eastern form of governance, in which we have the overflow of the conflict in Middle East into Africa, and that's Somalia. So you see that the Islamic fundamentalist groups would like to have a governance system that is based on the Sharia, and of course that is extremist approach to governance, which is totally opposed to the Western notion of democracy, where we have constitutionalism, and then we have certain fundamentals of freedom that we think are very dear to governance. The other issue is Somalia has a lot of challenges related to blocks in terms of the Eastern Bloc and, of course, the Western Bloc. And these superpowers are at play. Even as we speak now, we have a lot of differentiated interests in Somalia that are making the prosecution of the war very difficult. You may actually be interested to know that the Artemis, and formerly AMISOM, is fighting more or less alone. And where we have international support is not necessarily squarely supportive of this, other than a bit of funding that is going in and a bit of logistics, like lift capability that's supporting the AU mission in Somalia. So we have a lot of differentiated interests in terms of the power players. The Emiratis and other groups in the Arabian Peninsula have their own interests, and even between them, they have different interests. Then we have European Union, and some member states of European Union have their own different interests, and so is the America. So when you look at all that, it gives you a mix, a grand mix of so much differentiated interest that it's very hard to align the resolution processes in Somalia. And now when it comes to economic reasons where the West seems to be reluctant to continue paying now, and yet leaves them to be in control of the situation. You wonder whether they're not aiming at having a no war and a no peace situation for some conspiracy interests in Somalia.
So, David, you keep talking about, or you've talked severally about the role of Africa in sorting out its conflict issues. And the African Union had actually set a target to silence the guns by 2020. What is your take on the Silencing the Guns initiative, and why haven't the guns fallen silent?
Well, I think that was just a slogan, which was very good. But of course, that has to be followed by a strategy and an implementation plan. I've traveled across the continent and seen various conflicts, and I think I sum it to 6 simple steps, which I believe the African Union should adopt. The first step is to not beat around the bush when it comes to the motivational factors, and I'm talking about why people take up arms. That is the first strategy that each government needs to adopt. The second step is to deal with the issue of capacity and capabilities, which I'm talking about in the form of how do people recruit, where do they get money from, where do they buy weapons from, who supplies these weapons. The third element is to design a very powerful critical infrastructure strategy. The fourth one is to deal with the actors. Who are the people involved in this conflict, and what are the dynamics of these individuals? The fifth point is to look at the environment, because, of course, we're talking about Africa, but each ecosystem is different, and which has a connection to do with the motivational factors. The sixth point, which I think is very critical, and I've talked to you before, is the fact that we need to understand the interest of external parties. How do they come in? How do they influence these conflicts? Now, to sum all these 6 steps, to resolving conflict in Africa, there is one big thing which each government needs to do, and to look at governance structure. And governance structure would include, of course, leadership, would include institutions. This is what Africa needs, and these are very 6 simple steps. And if that is adopted by the African Union, instead of silencing the guns, which of course is just a slogan, I'm talking about a strategy. I'm talking about steps, right, that the African the African Union needs to adopt. And if this is adopted, whether we're talking about conflict in Northern Africa, in Sudan, or in Somalia, or in the Sahel, or in Nigeria, this is going to work as long as we follow the data that comes from this environment where this conflict is breeding and choking the continent from its economic development policies. Right.
So, Dr. Kaneje, is silencing the gun just a slogan by the African Union?
Beatrice, you can't silence the guns if you are silent about the guns. And we're not talking or taking any action in that direction. You can't silence the guns when you don't have a framework to be able to undertake that. Neither can you silence the guns without committing resources and funds to ensure that. Today, as we speak, despite the sloganeering, of course, by the African Union, and there are certain areas in which, of course, is doing honorably well, each $600 million budget, most of it is funded by foreigners. And to the extent that you cannot be able to build your own capacity, how can you undertake your programs and be able to implement your agenda if you're not even funding yourself? And that is a question that African Union has to confront.
Ambassador Mulonga, I want to get your view as a former head of the AMISOM. Is the African Union lacking a strategy to end Africa's conflicts?
African Union has very good ideas. They have very good programs. We established the African Peace and Security Architecture, in which we have various structures like the panel of the whites to help in preemptive actions through diplomatic engagements, and then African Standby Force, which is supposed to be at a brigade level throughout the 5 regions of Africa. And all these are supposed to be conflict prevention, management, and resolution measures. But as Hassan has said correctly, the funding is the biggest problem. We put in place some ideas. Kaberuha Commission that was put in place to consider options for funding. All those have come to a naught. And as such, really, without, you cannot prosecute a war that you're not in charge of the funding, including logistics. And I think that's one of the biggest problems. The second one is that we do not have, we have not developed our political authority to multilateral agencies. For example, either IGAD or ESC or ECOWAS and all these, they have not been given adequate authority to act on their own. You have to resort back to the capitals for any decision and so on. And if you deploy in the missions, you find that the commanders, the contingent commanders, have to take orders from their capitals other than from the command and control within the mission setup. So because of such lapses, it becomes prosecution of missions and operations such as that of Somalia extremely difficult. And of course, as has been alluded to, the fact that the external powers are the ones paying, then they dictate. And we have a lot of contradictions to the mission. For example, the UN, which is supporting us in Somalia, does not, in their notion and doctrine, support warfare. And yet the mission in Somalia is about war. So in the end of it all, you have such contradiction that the war is not prosecuted smoothly.
Right, I'm going to get to your winding up comments. Let me start off with you, Dr. Khaneje. The key here is implementation. What sort of reforms and changes, though, would be required to enhance the role of the global community, global institutions in keeping African wars in the global limelight?
Sloganeering has never been a substitute for sound policy or effective strategy. And if we have to look at the continent using the principle of subsidiarity, the African Union should encourage countries to capacitate existing national mechanisms as well as regional mechanisms for conflict resolution and management, and make them so robust that you can be able to attract external partners to be able to play a role in terms of adding value to it, instead of outsourcing and mortgaging our conflict management, to outside forces. We know that's the case of Libya, that external forces were responsible for actually the kind of mess we saw in Libya that has had a multiplier effect in terms of negative consequences for the entire Sahel region and increasingly even for the Horn of Africa region. And so being able to adopt and implement and capacity our own institutions, I think, is going to be one of the solid strategies of moving forward.
Ambassador Mulongo, your thoughts?
The purpose of forming the African Peace and Security Architecture was exactly to address those kind of challenges, where we are looked at as the secondary consumers of global peace support. And so we need to look at how we can internally capacitate ourselves, first and foremost. And secondly, we should bolster the regional collective security mechanism that we have, and make them more radio responsive to situations like those of Libya, Sudan, Somalia, and so on, away and very less of external support. Because once you have external support, then you attract dictates of the external supporters for some reasons. So, and I think that should be the case, that we should bolster our national capabilities, but also capacitate the regional collective security mechanisms, which can become much more useful and responsive to situations that we have on the continent.
David, you have the final word.
We have a continent that does not need any external support. We have all it takes. There is nothing wrong in collaboration and coordination. Africa is a very rich continent. We just have to manage our resources very well. And there we will have the required resources to deal with our conflicts. But the most important thing is that we need to have a comprehensive strategy, one that runs from the African Union down to regional bodies and down to individual country states. Now, within those country states, everyone can establish their national security strategies. And that is how you secure a country. That's how you secure a region. And that's how we should secure the African continent.
Gentlemen, thank you all very much for that insightful discussion. But that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to my guests, Dr. Hassan Khaneje, Director of the Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies, David Otto Endele, Director for the Geneva Center for Africa Security and Strategic Studies, and in Kampala via Zoom, Ambassador Simon Mulongo, former Deputy Head of AMISOM. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation through our social media platforms on Facebook and X. And you can watch this and other editions of Talk Africa on our YouTube playlist. Do join us again next week for more Talk Africa. For me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi. Until next time, bye-bye.